Hi, it's Rob Herman, and welcome to the Super Performers Podcast powered by 4100 FS. As we worked on developing this podcast, our overriding goal was to create a compelling platform for accessible insights on work and life from successful, driven, and highly accomplished leaders. Leaders with unique experiences across a wide variety of fields, including business, medicine, law, sports, entertainment, education, and philanthropy, among others. In my head, I started to work through a fascinating group I wanted as guests, and I got pretty excited about it. I've gotten to know these people through my own varied experiences early in my career on Capitol Hill, later working on Wall Street and as an investment manager, being an entrepreneur, and now leading a unique and thriving company called 4100 FS, while also focusing on community engagement. I think you'll really enjoy hearing the stories of these guests, learning about their respective paths, finding out what motivates them and how they define success. Glad to have you with us on the Super Performers Podcast. And without further ado, on to our guest today. Today on the Super Performers Podcast, our guest is Jackie Congedo. Jackie Congedo is a nationally recognized expert in the intersections of anti-Semitism, extremism, and civic engagement. She's passionate about the power of education and engagement to catalyze change and build community across lines of difference. She joined the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust Humanity Center's leadership team in July of 2022, and in July of 2024, she was selected as the organization's chief executive officer. Jackie has meaningfully grown the center's philanthropic base. She also oversaw the establishment and growth of a fee-for-service vertical that has engaged more than 50 organizations, generating significant revenue within its first year. She has cultivated relationships with donors and funders that's enabled dramatic expansion of public programming, the creation of digital storytelling initiatives, and considerable growth in school district partnerships and engagement. Prior to her work in Cincinnati's nonprofit community, Jackie spent nearly a decade as a broadcast journalist, working for stations in Washington, D.C., Lexington, Kentucky, and in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she specialized in enterprise and investigative storytelling. A native Marylander, she's called Cincinnati home for more than a decade. Jackie Congedo, welcome to the Super Performers Podcast. We've been talking about this for a while. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Rob. I'm so excited we found time to make this work and excited for the conversation.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, but let's start early days. You grew up in the Maryland area. You went to school there, and your first role out of school, you went to school for broadcast journalism, and you went straight to D.C. at that point in your first broadcasting job. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Maryland, your family, and the goal of going into journalism, generally speaking.
Yeah, so I'm a Mid-Atlantic gal, and I grew up. My dad's Italian Catholic, my mom's Jewish, and so I like to say that I grew up with thousands of pounds of food and guilt. Like heavy helpings of both. Yeah. And better off for it, I think, by and large. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been sort of like the kind of person who appreciates like the art of language and writing. Ever since I was young, I actually, my mom always says I actually sang before I talked. Like my first words were song and not not spoken. So I grew up singing and sort of performing as a kid. Thought initially that I wanted to go into medicine and sort of started in on a pre-med track and decided quickly that it wasn't for me. And was at the University of Maryland. They have an incredible broadcast journalism, really journalism school. And I just got to thinking about how, the idea of broadcast really combines my love of writing with sort of this, it's not really it is a performance element, but it's more about like, how do you craft a compelling narrative using words and video? And how do you work in partnership with somebody who really is a specialist in the video side to move people, in a way that informs them, but also touches them in a way that sticks with them and sort of um, helps them think about their role in the story. So, I got into broadcast in college and was really lucky to land my first job out of school. It's the benefit to going to school in the DMV area, right? The Washington metro area. Had a number of really great internships actually at the station that ended up hiring me right when I graduated, WJLA News Channel 8. So, coming out of college, I had this background, I had the experience and the familiarity with that newsroom. I in college was doing it's like a work, um, not really a work study, but it's a very hands-on program at Maryland where you actually produce a broadcast every day, and it's called the Capitol News Service. So we would have to turn daily stories, and it was really like being in the job. And my beat was Montgomery County, which is a suburb of DC. And so as I was graduating, having covered Montgomery County, having interned in this newsroom, WJLA News Channel 8 was hiring for a Montgomery County beat reporter. Just sometimes the world works out that way.
Excellent.
And I landed this job, this first job, and I was actually reflecting on this the other day. Remember walking into a newsroom, like a Washington DC newsroom at 21 years old, like mostly excited, probably 15% terrified, and just thinking this is a lot of people watching to make mistakes. Like when you're out there with the training wheels on, it's good to be able to make some mistakes where it doesn't count so much. And in an environment, in a market like Washington, it's hard to do that. So the stakes were high, but I had great colleagues, I had great mentors, and I ended up actually getting to do some fill-in reporting on WJLA on the broadcast side. I was hired on the News Channel 8 side, which is the cable station, and was run with one-man bands. We now know what those are, but at the time it was relatively rare, and it was a giant camera. And I mean, it was like the most insane paraphernalia that I had all around with me on the cobblestone streets of the Capitol. I have some real funny horror stories about that sometime that I can share. But yeah, and then I had to like think about what was next. And I was either gonna stay in DC and sort of try and put down the camera and make a name for myself on the network side and try and, be the little engine that was gonna be reporting alongside people who've spent their whole career in news and landed in the Washington market, like trying to say, okay, well, just let me have that full-time network job, with 9 months experience right out of college, which is unlikely. Or I could go put the camera down because, again, most days I was reporting for News Channel 8, which was this, I was my own camera person and reporter and editor and the whole thing. Put the camera down. I'm going to go to like a mid-sized market and really like hone my skills as a reporter with the partnership of a photographer and cut my teeth on how to break stories and how to really compete for a lead story with, other reporters. And so that's what I did. And I ended up in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah, which is an interesting change of venue for sure. For what it's worth, it's pretty heady stuff, as you mentioned, being in DC, that area. You may know this, we've been friends for a while, but I was very early in my career, my early 20s, I was a press secretary in DC for a congressman. And I saw how hard those reporters worked and how hard broadcast journalism was in that market. And it's pretty heady stuff. You're kind of in the center of a lot.
Yeah.
So to your point, it's a lot to adapt to right out of college, even though you've gotten some experience along the way.
Yeah. I mean, I remember calling, I was on assignment. And the other thing about that newsroom that was so interesting is, one day I'd be in Annapolis covering like new legislation about, cell phones and driving. And I'd be literally hauling my own camera around to legislative hearings in Annapolis. And then they'd want me to go get what we call MOS, man on the street, sound bites from teenagers who are leaving their high school, like trying to, chase people as they're headed to their cars to say, what do you think about this new legislation? So all of that. And then I'd have to like get in my little Ford Focus and snap feed is what it was back in the day. Snap feed the stories back. And then, I'd get a call from the newsroom that's like, hey, can you anchor Good Morning Washington tomorrow? And we know it's 5:00. We need you in at 2 a.m. Can you do it? And I remember calling a mentor of mine from college and being like, I don't know that I can do this. Like, what if I mess this up? A lot of people are watching, just like the imposter syndrome. And you learn quickly that like you just take the opportunities when they come and you pick up and you do it. So it taught me a lot more than, just industry specific stuff. It taught me about confidence. It taught me about um, how to really make the most of an opportunity. But it was a intimidating uh prospect right out of school for sure. And yeah, one day I was in Annapolis and the next day I was on the Hill, and it's really a news market where like local meets national, right? So
Yeah.
actually the story I remember covering on the Hill was it was when the comedy writers were on strike. One of the
Yep.
times they went on strike, and they were doing these like mock hearings on the Hill, which were hilarious because it was all the comedy writers. And so they sent me, but you have to navigate the maze of like, congressional buildings and, parking in the middle of Capitol Hill. And I'm hauling my own camera, all my own gear. And I just remember I had it all on a cart, and, DC streets, the sidewalks are these cobblestone streets. And all of a sudden it went from like chink, 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 chink to like chink boom, and I look behind me and the entire lens of the camera, this giant DVC Pro camera, is just dragging. It's just literally bumping along behind the rest of it. So then I became like, a camera engineer and figured out how to fix the camera so I could go shoot. But it's like those kinds of stories are priceless now. And honestly,
Yeah.
when I'm having a day that's like, how am I going to get this done? I'm like, you figured it out under much harder circumstances in the past. So
Right. I mean, those are great war stories. And when you think about it, you mentioned the word confidence. It's the lessons we teach our kids. That at the end of the day, that muscle memory, that experience being in the trenches prepares you for what happens later. And we'll talk about what happens later with you and what you're doing now, which is so impactful at the Holocaust and Humanity Center. But tell me about that experience of moving to Lexington. I don't know if you knew anybody in Lexington, if you had any frame of reference. You're a Maryland, Mid-Atlantic gal. What's what's that experience like?
didn't
What was the job? What was the experience like?
Didn't know a soul, didn't know a person. I remember moving there, and the first few days, I just thought, okay. It was, I moved a couple days before I had to start work. And I guess the good and the bad about working in news is it's monopolizing, right? It's like your entire identity. You're working
Right.
all the time, all hours, whenever they need you, every holiday. And so you build community with the people you work with, really. And you don't have a lot of other time to think about or do much else. So, but I did have a few days before I started, and I was just remember like sitting in this apartment, like, I don't know anybody here. I need to make sure that I go out and talk to at least 3 people every day before I start. So it's just like exercising again these muscles of like, how do you build relationships where no network exists, and how do you have to become kind of, not just able to navigate in any job in a new city, but to be able to navigate a news job. You have to know the civic infrastructure, you have to know all the leadership, you have to see, it
Right.
takes a while to like get to know all of that. Now, luckily, you're working in a newsroom that's used to hiring new reporters every 3 years, right? It's these mid-sized markets, people come and go. And so that they were helpful in, some of the orienting, but it just takes like a I'm going to figure it out attitude. It was also really interesting, as someone who's Jewish, like in Lexington, and there is actually a really shout out to the Jews of Lexington. There's a strong Jewish community in Lexington. Um, but it was definitely not a newsroom that was like packed with people who were like me. And so,
Hmm.
that had its kind of interesting nuances here and there. I remember at one point, I think it was one of the holidays, and I had to work one of the Jewish holidays, and it was either Pesach and like, with the eating bread or not, or maybe it was on a fasting holiday. I can't remember. But I remember trying to explain to like a gas station attendant, who I was buying a snack from, that why I had to have this snack. And she was like, I was like, I shouldn't have even really probably tried. But again, it was practice. I mean, all of it, when I look back about where I am now and what's serving me well, it's that I had these experiences with people who were not like me in an environment where I was one of the only people who, you know, thought, believed like I did. And
Yeah.
I think that's like a really important awareness for really any of us living in the world today, but specifically for people who are trying to do this work of like coalition building and of, helping to create shared narratives. I mean, it's I'm really grateful for all of those experiences because they've helped me tremendously.
It strikes me that the being a broadcast journalist and doing what you were doing, first of all, the through line of your career, because you did a lot of work in investigative storytelling for broadcast journalism, and that's consistent with the way your career developed post broadcast journalism going into nonprofit leadership. But also, I mean, what a way to get to know a city. I mean, you must know the Lexington market and the ins and outs of Lexington better than some natives, given what your job was. And that's really interesting. And it must, even when you drive through Lexington or visit Lexington, I don't know how much you have an occasion to do that these days. You're busy here in Cincinnati, but it must give you a pretty unique take. And so, how long were you in Lexington for?
So I was there for 3 years. I was there for a contract cycle of 3 years. Yeah. Yeah. Long
Got it.
enough to meet a husband, which, like
So
I always
is that
say,
where
if
you met your
nothing
husband?
else, that was a great win to leave Lexington with.
Is he a Lexington native?
No, he's not. It's interesting. So my husband is from Western Kentucky. He's from a little town on the Ohio River called Lewisport, which is sort of suburbs, if you want to call it that, of Owensboro,
Mhm.
Evansville area.
Yeah.
And so he was coming to Lexington via Beckley, West Virginia was his first job. And so I was coming to, for me, I was like going from the big city to a very small city. And for him, he thought he had just like won the lottery and had landed in this like metropolitan hub of Lexington. It's all relative. And,
Right.
we were on like a similar contract cycle. He started a week after I did. And so I was just grateful that I wasn't the new person anymore. And he got to take the weekend shift and then they didn't hire anybody for like a year after that. So I'm always like, that's such a perfect emblem for how he has consistently taken one for the team in our relationship. But, yeah, so we dated for the last year of our contract and weren't really ready to get engaged or make any moves for each other yet. So as I said, he stayed in Lexington, took one for the team, signed another contract there. I had an amazing job opportunity in Cincinnati for Channel 5 and moved north of the river. And we commuted for a while, on off days to be able to see each other. And it's, a little
Right.
over an hour, so not far. And then he got out of the business first and got into public relations. And shortly after, I would say, right after we got married, I followed and got into nonprofit work.
So what was the opportunity at Channel 5, which is the NBC affiliate here in Cincinnati? What was the opportunity? It was a bigger market, obviously. Was it reporting? You started to really hone that investigative journalism piece of your skill set in broadcast journalism. Was it more of that coming to Cincinnati?
Yeah, so certainly there was more of that. To be honest with you, Rob, there was an amazing news manager who hired me, Stacey Owen, who I think is now still in the Bay Area. One of these like women who lifts other women, um, you know, who just is in it for all the right reasons. And they were building a team of, this was back, I think, when Channel 5 was really trying to make like a run to really be in it competitively with the other stations. I think they had kind of been a little bit behind in the glory days of, um, Jerry Springer and Norma Rashid, and we're sort of in hindsight and in the rear view, and so they were trying to kind of rebuild this.
By the way, for those who don't know this, Jerry Springer, from a Cincinnati perspective, I know there's the national perspective, and
Yeah,
people listening to this that aren't in Cincinnati may not know this, but
right.
Jerry Springer was a very well respected, first of all, political figure, but then also he was, and it led to his show, which initially was a more serious
Yes,
news
yes,
program. But as a news anchor, he was stellar. And I think at that point, to your point about the glory days of Channel 5, I think they were in the lead and everybody knew Jerry and his co-anchor, Norma Rashid.
yep.
It evolved. His reputation's a little different in hindsight. But to your point, if they were chasing that, those were the glory days of Channel 5.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you for the clarity on that. Yes. So they were working to try and rebuild a team and do more investigative work and build a bench of reporters who could not just, really dig in on investigative stories, but who could anchor as well and, like a pipeline of talent. And so um I had this opportunity to work for an amazing woman at a station that was like really offering a lot of opportunity. And Channel 5 is still owned by Hearst, which is, a wonderful news organization, and they own a number of properties around the country, across the country. One of them is Baltimore, Maryland.
Wow.
At the number one station in WBAL in Baltimore. And I thought, okay, this is my ticket to get back home. I'm just gonna, they promote from within. I'm gonna do my time in the city called Cincinnati. I don't know anything about it. Like I've never been there either. And I'm gonna just figure it out like I did in Lexington, and then I'll be on my way in a few years. And Cincinnati has a way of just roping you in. So
That it does.
yeah, so I did 2 contract cycles in Cincinnati, did a lot more investigative work, got to do some, fill-in anchoring, made a lot of really good friends. Adam and I got married, and next thing you knew, we had, like, 2 Buckeye kids, and here we are. Like, I don't think we're going anywhere. We've recruited my mom from the DC area, so now, like, we are Cincinnatians, even though people will still frequently remind me that I didn't go to high school here and that I don't have a 513 area code, which is
Y-
okay.
y- Yeah. Well, I grew up in Cincinnati. However, I still have a New York-based area code because I don't want to give up my cell phone number. So I'm still seen as suspect, even though I grew up here.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. The gravitational pull of Cincinnati is very strong, and somehow, same thing with my parents who were immigrants. They ended up here, and it's actually my parents are really the reason we got to know each other because they're both Holocaust
Yeah.
survivors.
Yep.
And you were kind enough to put me on a Holocaust and Humanity Center podcast to talk about them a little bit, which was really gratifying. But I think, there is that gravitational pull of Cincinnati. And then you made the decision to leave broadcast journalism. And that transition, I'm curious how it happened. You went to being the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. And for context, the focus, and I think this is really interesting. And again, we talk about through lines in your career, your professional life. It's consistent, focus on Jewish security by working in coalitions, a word you already used, with diverse communities to build a more just society for all people. I see a lot of similarities in that work with what you're doing now,
Yep.
with the Holocaust and Humanity Center. But I think it's really interesting because it talks about Jewish security, but it's really about building a broader, just society for everybody. And I really like the way that's framed. So tell me a little bit about how that happened. You're going through your second contract cycle, and now you're thinking about maybe leaving broadcast journalism or the opportunity presented itself. I'm curious to hear more about how that all evolved.
Yeah, I started to feel more and more every day, and shout, to all the amazing people at Channel 5 who I have so much respect for, the leadership of of Hearst and the station. And I always say if there was anywhere that I would have stayed in news, it would have been Channel 5.
No.
Because we really are talking about like grade A journalists who are so committed to the community. Um, John London, Karen Johnson. I mean, these people are doing this because they believe passionately in the role that they play for Cincinnatians, for the community, which I think is so admirable and getting harder every day. So it was less of like a push from that station specifically, and more of just I started to kind of think about, first of all, getting married, wanting to be a mom. I wanted to make sure I was home for dinner with my kids at night, and
Yeah.
the holy grail in TV is that 2:30 to 11:30 slot, right, where you're anchoring or reporting for the late evening news and for the early and the late evening news. And I just, it was one of those moments in my career where I realized, wow, like I've been running, running, running towards this like prize. And I don't even know that I want the prize anymore. Like,
Right.
I think what I want is changing. And that was coupled with the fact that I just felt like, you know, there's lots of ways to make a difference. There's really only one way to be on TV. So
Yeah.
if you're, and that's not to knock anybody who's doing it. Because like I said, it's important. And but for me, I just thought I'm in this because I care about people, I care about stories, um I care about the connection of narrative and how we kind of can create shared narratives in our world and in our communities. I don't really care about the TV thing. Like, I just the superficial nature of it and some of the stuff that seemed arbitrary about, like who pairs well with who at an anchor desk or like those kinds of things. I just was like, this is not really where I think I'm best positioned to play. I think I can have a bigger impact somewhere else. And so I started thinking about that, and it wasn't a rush job to, run out of there. I was really trying to think carefully about what would serve my sort of personal and professional interests best in the next step. And I ended up seeing a posting. Actually, initially it was for public relations um, at the Federation, at the Jewish Federation. And at the time, like, I have an interesting Jewish journey. We may not have time to get into that. I'm not sure how many folks listening would even really care, but um, I was
Well, I
raised.
think that's always an interesting journey, especially given your family background.
Yeah.
The diversity of your mother and your father. So it's worth hearing because I think we all think about ethnicity, faith, and
Identity,
all of that
yeah.
and how it works out. So a couple minutes would be great on that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I like to say that, on the East Coast, particularly I think on the East Coast, there's, like, on-ramps to Jewish identity, right? And you either kind of prioritize the on-ramp and you make the on-ramp or you miss it. And I think that, like, growing up in relatively rural Maryland, right? It was between Baltimore and Washington, but it was, like, sort of northwest of, Baltimore, well, northwest of DC and south of Baltimore. Um,
Mhm.
and it was in a, in an area that was actually a lot like many of the communities in Cincinnati, like suburban, if not trending towards rural. There wasn't a lot of Jewish community infrastructure, and interfaith relationships were like still pretty new, right? Like there weren't a lot of people who were doing this. And so to my mom and dad's credit, I mean, they were kind of pioneers in this space and they didn't
Right.
have a lot of community to plug into in the way that felt comfortable for them. And so, we celebrated holidays with my grandparents and, in their home. And I felt really connected to my grandparents, but of course also to my mom's parents, the Jewish side of my family, but also was connected to my dad's, family. And so I grew up with this like kind of human first approach to like, these are all people I love and care about. They think differently and they have different traditions. And I always felt in me like more connection to my mom's side, but in the American context, people would ask me like, "Well, are you Jewish or are you Christian? What do you believe in? What do you?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know. What do I believe in? Be a good person, treat other people the way you want to be treated." Like, I don't
Right.
know that I have an answer to exactly what happens to your soul when you die or what, where you go or what God looks like. I just and I didn't think it was really I thought the first most important thing was like, how are we treating other people in this life that we have? Um and so what I'm describing now I realize is actually a very Jewish outlook, right?
Right.
Um, and at the time, I just was like, well, I didn't have a bat mitzvah. I don't know Hebrew. I'm not part of a Jewish sorority later on in college. I didn't I went to one summer Jewish camp and the showers were too cold, wasn't going back. Although now I wish I'm actually a little mad at my parents for not forcing me to go back because I think I would have really liked it if I'd just been regardless. Um, so I just was like, I didn't feel like I had any of the like religious checkbox items to feel like authentic in that identity. And it wasn't until I started working at the Federation, um, and understood, kind of from that foundation of like community, right? JCC, community engagement, not through the portal of a synagogue or through like religious observance, but through this idea of being bound up in a community of other people who share the same values and sort of culture and custom and tradition and history. That really spoke to me and I felt really at home in that. And I realized, oh my gosh, like this has just been this way all along. I just didn't have a language to help to even explain to
Right.
myself what that identity was like, let alone other people. And I think a lot of American Jews struggle with that because we're put in this box as a religious group, alongside Christianity and Islam and, all of the other world religions. And we really are kind of like an apple among oranges, right? It's like, yes, some Jews are religious, some Jews aren't. Um, but there's much more to it. It's this like idea of kind of shared peoplehood and ritual and, history and destiny that kind of binds us together. So for me, it was really an evolution, and the JCRC role was just such a perfect um, it was really a beautiful, like, match made in heaven for me, um, in terms of how I felt connected as a Jew. Um, I like to say that, like, I think I changed the JCRC a little bit, but really the JCRC changed me. And,
Yeah.
it was a great couple, I mean, it was a couple of years. I was there for almost 7 years. But to your point, this mission, right, of security through a more just community for all people, I think is it's also just like such a Jewish way to look at the world, that
Yeah.
we're only as safe as the least safe among us. And we have to have friendships and allies and alliances, and we have to have a strong civil society and strong institutions. And that ultimately is what protects us. Now, you know, the tension between the particular and the universal, right? The like build more walls, have more police officers, drill down. And there's definitely, I think, an element of sort of Jewish thought and Jewish community that's like, when things get rough, we're going to turn inward, and we're going to focus on the particular, and we're going to take care of ourselves, right? And that's not just exclusive to Jews. I think that's just the thing that happens in like tribal environments when things get
Right.
scarce. But I think that, like, the push and pull between, like, the particular nature of Jewish security, how do we protect ourselves in, like, a very practical, tangible, pragmatic, physical way, and how do we protect ourselves as part of a broader pluralistic society, really spoke to me, just like how those things live in tension with each other. And that was the work at JCRC. And as you mentioned, Rob, like that, so much of that particular and universal tension and the opportunity to kind of marry the Jewish story with the civic story, and to bridge those things is exactly the work that we're doing at the Holocaust and Humanity Center. And that ultimately was the decision. That was what sort of brought me to the crossroads and the decision point to, to step into this, not this role, but the role I first joined the center in external affairs, because I'm really passionate about the opportunity to build bridges, the opportunity to connect again the Jewish story with the broader universal Cincinnati story. And there is no better place or organization that is physically or sort of like from a mission standpoint situated to do that than the Holocaust and Humanity Center.
No, no question. And it's so, as we've talked about, it's such a timely conversation to have. So first of all, your points about identity, and in this case, it's Jewish identity. It doesn't have to be really resonate with me, and I'm sure many other people listening to this, because there's no one way. If the traditional conception you gave the example of, I didn't have a bat mitzvah, I wasn't part of a Jewish sorority. I remember going to college, and I didn't have a huge Jewish population around me. It was very small actually growing up. But I remember going to my dorm. I went to University of Michigan undergrad. For Ohio State fans, I apologize, but my dorm was full of people from Long Island, and most of them were Jewish, and it was I didn't feel any sense of connection to them because they were Jewish. And I learned over a long period of time that lesson that you did, which is there's a lot of different ways to feel any kind of identity, whether it be Jewish identity or otherwise. And that's, I think, a really important point you make. But I think significantly, when I look at some of the work, for example, this Leaders in Light Institute, which specifically was around addressing extremism and polarization, so important then, even more important now, and obviously very applicable to, I'm sure it's part of why you joined the Holocaust and Humanity Center and evolved into what is now your leadership role running the Holocaust and Humanity Center. So you started in that external affairs role, and I know that from a leadership perspective, there had been some changes in leadership. There was an interim CEO, David Wise, who's great, and I know you evolved into the role. But tell me a little bit about making that decision, going to the Holocaust and Humanity Center, and then taking over the leadership role with some changes going on in the background too.
Yeah. So, I was really excited, really for two reasons. One is this idea that when I thought about the work that I really wanted to do, the work of building these bridges and helping to, you know, weave narratives from particular and universal. And and what I really love so much about the work that we do is it's grounded in a very particular story about what happened to Jews in the 1930s and 40s. But this story is a universal human story that has implications for all of humanity, right? And so
Yes.
so I was very excited about doing that work and doing it in this amazing civic space of Union Terminal alongside our incredible partners at the Cincinnati Museum Center, Elizabeth Pierce and her team, and the opportunity to do that like in an unprecedented way at scale. And I was really excited about working with Sarah Weiss
Yeah. Well,
because
Sarah is the driving force behind the early days of the museum and where it led. You're taking it to new levels now, but she was kind of the foundational point, correct?
Sarah was, yeah. I mean, it's hard to overstate Sarah's impact on the center. Sarah grew what was a sort of fledgling, very small exhibit at Hebrew Union College and then at Rockburn Jewish Day School in Kenwood into a premier education civic organization grounded in the icon that is Union Terminal. I mean, positioned to welcome, thousands and thousands of people who would otherwise never have a reason to visit a place like that, into that space for that kind of learning and with partnerships. I mean, we now have partnerships with more than a dozen, well, I think actually far more now than a dozen school districts all across the tri-state region, 15,000 kids a year we touch. So it's a dramatically different sort of delivery at scale of mission. And the
Incredibly different, like night and day, because to your point, I'll say this more than once, most likely, and I'm sure you will too. But Union Terminal as a venue is an incredible place. So just for that reason alone, it's worth the price of admission. But it seems so appropriate for the Holocaust Humanity Center to be in that venue, just given the history of the Holocaust Humanity Center alongside Union Terminal. It's just there's a lot of reasons to visit Union Terminal, but the Holocaust and Humanity Center, from where it started, to your point about Sarah Wise, it's it's really amazing.
Yeah, and every day I feel like I need a bracelet that says like, "What would Sarah do?" I'm like always like, you know, am I making her proud? And like how she cared because she stewarded this mission so beautifully, and really not just the mission, but the stories and the people. I mean, the core survivor community, your parents and others. This is like family for Sarah, and I feel a tremendous like responsibility to make sure to do justice to that legacy. But so she I think got us through this amazing inflection point to really deliver on the mission at a much broader scale. And then she decided I have been, so I said, yes, I want to partner with you. You're an amazing, strong woman leader. And I can't wait to like, we're so aligned on how we think about things. Like, we're going to do amazing things together. And then she said she was leaving. That was like on day -3, which I think she would be okay with me sharing with you. Like, and there's no hard feelings. I mean, people have these pathways and they have to figure out how to
Right.
navigate and what's next for them. And she's in a great role now, that is a sort of a different role for her. And I think really thriving, and the community is certainly benefiting with her in that space. So, all good. But at the moment, I'm thinking like, what? Like, and she sort of like hinted at the time, I don't know what your aspirations are from a leadership development state, from a, like long terms, long. And I said, well, wait a minute. I don't know about that. I need to like absorb this news and what's happening in the interim. And so David Wise, as you mentioned, our good friend David Wise, who is just, um, I don't know that I've met anybody quite like David in all the best ways. Like
Yeah.
he is we'll talk about a super performer. Like this guy runs through walls regularly for all the right reasons. And
Hmm.
he's just the kind of person you always want to have on your team because he's fearless and he's so smart and he's compassionate and he's loyal and he's driven with like the spirit of justice. He's just a great guy. Anyway, I didn't know him
Agreed.
from Adam at the time. And so she said, David Wise, our board chair, is going to step in and sort of get us through this interim. We have a lot of growing to do. We had just received this transformational gift, an accelerated legacy gift that is quite substantial and was going to allow us to do a lot more. There was some sort of staff work culture work that we needed to do. And David heroically, which if you know him, it's not terribly surprising that he would be up for this, but stepped in and worked really with me every step of the way. I mean, he brought me along and said, with the idea that we're not assuming this might be for you in the future. We'll see if you feel it's a good fit, if the organization feels it's a good fit, but let's do this in partnership and kind of see how this develops and what the organization needs, what you feel, you can deliver. And we worked for 2 years side by side and sort of, I think structurally got the organization, in the kind of shape to really pave a pathway forward into the next 5-10 years. And I always said, along the way, I was like, I really want to see what the organization needs in a leader. If you look at Holocaust museums, around the world, there are Holocaust scholars who are running Holocaust museums. There are museum operators who are running Holocaust museums. There are business experts, who have a strong finance and accounting acumen who are running Holocaust museums. And then there are people who have a knack for how to sort of communicate about this externally, how to position, how to engage stakeholders. And that's really where I feel like the value that I can deliver. But I'm like, I don't know if that's what is needed here. So let's just see how this thing evolves and develops. And if I'm the person who my skills can be useful in this role, and we can build sort of a team that can deliver the other pieces, around me. I think it's an amazing opportunity, but I wanted to let that kind of develop organically. And it just so happened that it did. So, now I just get the privilege actually of being at the tip of the spear, but um, the incredible work that happens at the Holocaust and Humanity Center is to the credit of the incredible team that I am privileged to lead. I mean, the experts in education, in terms of how to reach students and teachers, the experts in Holocaust scholarship, our amazing scholar in residence, and our head of Holocaust programs and museum experiences, Trinity Johnson, who knows our survivor community like the back of her hand, who is getting her PhD, who's a tremendous scholar in and of herself.
And has a great backstory religiously as well.
She does.
Having converted to Judaism. She's a fascinating person and just a superhuman being.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, we have excellence in operations as well. We recently, not so recently, she'll remind me, 6 months ago, brought on a new COO, Christine Permy, who has a background in nonprofit leadership, an MBA, CPA. She's outstanding. And so, we are committed to excellence in every space. And I just get to have the privilege of clearing obstacles for all these people to do their best work. So it's been a great journey, but it was definitely not, I always say, I didn't have run a Holocaust museum on my vision board for 2025. I really had no intention of necessarily, but sometimes this is how things happen. And it has been an amazing opportunity.
You're overseeing a lot of growth. I know your team has grown from 7 to 25, I think it is now.
Yeah.
And it speaks to, and it's a broader conversation about how the museum has evolved, which we'll get to. And development is part of that. Programming is part of that. You mentioned partnerships. But it's interesting just for context, for people that may not know the museum, and in the show notes, we'll make sure there's a link to the museum and remind people to go visit, because it really is an incredible experience. Every time I go back, I learn something new. But it strikes me that, and this speaks to your skill set as well, and various people being the right fit for a leadership role, even in the context of museums that focus on Holocaust education. I do think the Holocaust and Humanity Center, though, and you may want to comment on this, is different in some ways because to me, it's very forward looking. It's not just looking at the past, but it's thinking about how you use the past as a tool to inform solving problems and focusing on community. And you've already talked a lot about that. So it's very consistent with the way your career has evolved. But do you want to talk a little bit? Because I think about, there's a lot of different ways to think about peer groups. In this case, Holocaust museums or museums focused on genocide, things like that. But I do think the museum is somewhat unique in the way it approaches it. So I'd love to hear more context on that.
I would say that the unique approach that we take, and it truly, I can say authoritatively, is a unique approach. I was just in Israel last week with other Holocaust Museum executives from all over the world, and there are very few who I think are doing the work like we're doing it in Cincinnati, and that is to the credit of people like your parents, honestly. The survivors who came here in the 1930s and 40s and since then, who said eventually, of course, someone I think said when we were in Israel in our cohort, they said, first we rebuilt, then we remembered. And so there was a gap between when they arrived um, and when they started really talking about what had happened, when they started, and you probably know this as the child of survivors, right? Um, they were new immigrants and refugees who were focused on rebuilding their lives first and foremost. And then they said, wow, we may have a story here that's worthwhile in terms of like our collective human responsibility to each other and our communities. And so but that was this idea, as the the survivor group kind of you know united around this mission of education. That was their vision, was not just to tell the history for the sake of talking about history, but to ensure the lessons of history inspire action today. That's the mission of the center. So, and we have the amazing privilege of being able to do this work in a space of possibility, hope, revival, resilience, rebuilding. And I say a space of that in two ways. One, the physical space, right? We are located, as you, I think, alluded to, in this amazing, iconic building, Cincinnati's Union Terminal, which is still a train station, but was certainly a far more active, busy train station back in the 30s and 40s, welcoming and sending off people to and from deployments, people coming in and out of cities and in and out of the country in the case of our survivors. Um, and among the folks in that building were these 2,000, we think, around about in the 1930s and 40s Holocaust survivors who took their first steps at rebuilding their lives through the building where our museum is now located. And so we have this privilege of being able to talk about things like, trains. People think about trains in the Holocaust. They think about trains of deportation to death camps. And certainly those trains were a part of the history. And we have them. That story is told in the museum. And we are located at the site of trains that brought people to life. And for our survivors, that's a different story, right? So we have like I said, the positioning, both physically and then from a mission standpoint, because we tell the stories of local survivors, because the history is told through sort of a story forward approach and not necessarily a history forward approach. It's different, really humanized. And we're telling the stories through people who survived it, who had the resilience and the grit and the determination and the hope to be able to rebuild. That's the flavor of how we tell it, right? So it is a totally different experience. And then, the other part I think that makes us really unique is that, yes, we're a Holocaust museum and a Holocaust resource center, but we're also a humanity center. What does that mean? And so what it means in our physical spaces, you can come through, and our first gallery is a Holocaust gallery. You're going to learn about the history through the stories and the testimony of people like your parents who survived this. But then you're actually going to pivot midway through, and we ask the question, what was it about the people who stood up? Were they extraordinary people? Are there only certain people who have that in them, that capacity? Were they just sort of people built for that moment? Or do we all actually have the capacity in us to be the best of humanity today? So it asks us not to say, what does it look like not to be bad, right? But instead, what should we aspire to? And how do we channel those character strengths? So this is really the framework we use in the museum in each of us to be the light in our world, to be the best of humanity. It's not enough not to be the bad. We have to ask ourselves what good looks like, and we have to cultivate that and practice that and be aware of what in each of us makes us sort of uniquely positioned to contribute in that way. So we have a whole gallery, our humanity gallery, dedicated to right now. We're going to actually completely renovate, and we're in the process of re-envisioning that entire gallery right now. But right now, when you walk through, in fact, we have, like I said, many, many, many students who come through our Cincinnati Public School ninth graders. We have a partnership with Cincinnati Public Schools. Every ninth grader comes to the museum, and as they're sitting in the what we call the Points of Light Theater, which is the pivot point between the Holocaust and the humanity galleries, they watch the film, which features one of our survivors who, rebuilt his life in Cincinnati, and many years later came across an incident of Holocaust denial. Right, someone had written an op-ed in the Inquirer talking about how the Diary of Anne Frank was a hoax, and what about this stuff about the 6 million? And he had survived a death march out of Auschwitz, and he had a choice. Right, he had a choice to respond in anger or to find, as is said in the museum, a better way. And he chose to respond from a place of strength and perspective. And he was the first survivor in Cincinnati to share his story publicly, opening the way for what became our museum. Right. So, um, so, after students watch that film, we hand them a piece of paper that lays out all of these character strengths. We partner with the VIA Institute on Character, which is a positive psychology um, lab. Essentially, they resource globally this framework of positive psychology in terms of how to think about it from a leadership development standpoint, from a team culture standpoint, but also from a human thriving standpoint. What does it look like to be our best selves, and how does that make us better, our communities better, the world better? So we use this framework, and we hand these kids a page with 24 character strengths that scientists have sort of come together and researched and landed on as in terms of 24 strengths that are universally valued across time and space. And we say, pick a strength that you think is essential to who you are, and then go into the humanity gallery, read about stories of other upstanders, is what we call these folks, who rise for justice for themselves and other people. Go find a story of someone who has the same strength and see what they did with it. So that's how it looks right now. We could talk if you want about what the new gallery is going to look like, but it's this whole idea of it's not enough. Like, if we're stopping at the end of the history, it's only half the story. The rest of the story is, what's my role? How do I think about the lessons from this history in terms of how I'm inspired and equipped to respond today?
Yeah, that's such an important focus, especially in a somewhat divisive world now. And you talked about that's a great summary. Thank you, Jackie. And you talked about upstanders. It's a big thing that my father uses that term quite a bit. Being an upstander is not easy, but the focus of that, being an upstander, and how that relates to the museum's mission, the center's mission, is so incredibly important. Talk a little bit about the upstander awards that you've developed, and it's indicative also of the growth of the center and the awareness of the center. The the number of people that attend the upstander awards and the concept around it, really compelling stuff.
Yeah. So our upstander awards is sort of our signature public program. It's embedded within a month of upstander focused programming, which we call our upstander month, our Cohen family upstander month, in June. And so if you've ever been in Union Terminal's Rotunda, it's a site you will not soon forget. But we host this in the Rotunda. It's a beautiful sort of Art Deco dome that's like awe-striking just to be in. A little hard to hear in, but we found a way around that too. And it's a gala style event, 800 people. We bring in a celebrity MC. So we had Katie Couric the first year. Last year we had Deborah Messing, and you are the first publicly to know that this year we are this close. I haven't signed the contract yet, so maybe I shouldn't even say it, but it's just a matter of signing the contract with Jesse Eisenberg.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a big deal.
Yeah, who recently, starred in and wrote A Real Pain, which was the Oscar-winning film. Kieran Culkin won for Best Supporting Actor. Anyway, so we have a celebrity.
That's super exciting. A good scoop there.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So, so we bring in a celebrity MC, and then really the beauty of it, if you can get over the amazing, location and the awe, the sparkle of the celebrity host, is the awards that we give out. And so there are a lot of organizations that have some kind of a, annual recognition award. And most of them, I think, are recognizing people who are really doing great things and certainly deserving, but are used to a spotlight, right? I mean, we do something very different, which is we're trying the whole concept of an upstander. We want to break it down from people thinking about like Martin Luther King, and these iconic figures who did amazing things, but it's like I'm not Martin Luther King, right? I'm how can I contribute? Like, what is my pathway? So we use these upstander as awards as a way to spotlight everyday people who are using their character strengths to make change and to do amazing, to really be the best of humanity today, right? And we do it in a way that's really beautiful. So we give out awards that are named after our survivors through the lens of a shared character strength. So I'll give you one example. Last year, um, one of the stories we tell in the museum is the story of Sam Boymel. Sam was Sam was the basically the only survivor of his family uh, in a mass killing site episode in Poland by the Einsatz group, and these were mobile killing units of Nazi mobile killing units who would go town by town through Eastern Europe, round up entire communities of Jews, kill them one bullet at a time at gunpoint. And so he was a young teenager. He's in line. Often there was a level of deception in this. And so they didn't know where they were being marched to. But soon his mother sees and she's in line next to him. And she says her name is Rachel, which becomes important here in a minute. So Rachel Boymel and her son, Sam. Rachel sees what's coming. She says, run. He runs. He actually meets a neighbor who the family knows. He says, listen, help me. You know my father. You got to help me. The neighbor pushes him back in line and says, it's your day to die today. He goes back. His mother sees him again, wraps her scarf around his neck because it's cold and she knows she's not going to survive this, but he might, and says, you have to run towards the woods. They won't chase you through the woods. So he runs through the woods and he makes it to a barn. There's another neighbor who agrees to shelter him in his barn. And he eventually goes on to survive the war alone, joining the partisans as a teenager in the woods, bombing German train tracks. Incredible story. And the whole thing was made possible by his mom, right? Who gave him the courage and sort of that final gesture of motherly love in the face of her own mortality. So we named an award after Rachel, Sam's mom.
Yeah.
This past year, the Rachel Boymel Award for Love. And we had an amazing recipient. Yeah, it was really it when this was all like, when the award was given this, and I was like, there was not a dry eye in the whole place. The recipient is Rosemary Oglesby Henry. Rosemary has started an organization called Rosemary's Babies. Great organization. A little bit of an interesting pick on the name. Although when your name's Rosemary and you're talking about teen moms, like it makes sense. Rosemary was a teen mother. She grew up, I think it was in Evanston. And, there wasn't a lot of support for people who were living this experience. She remembers her grandmother being kind of like a rock in her life and a safe place. Her home was always where she kind of found safety and love and care. And she grew up to say, this was my experience. We need more resources for people who are in this situation. And she started basically a whole organization that supports teen mothers, which is Rosemary's Babies. Anyway, so we gave Rosemary the Rachel Boymel Award for Love. And Rosemary and Rachel's grandson, so Sam's son, Steve Boymel, who's on our board and still very active in the community and in our work. Steve was the one to present the award to Rosemary on stage in front of 800 people with Deborah Messing there. And Rosemary, after the fact, came down to the museum. She was actually on our podcast, on our digital media, we did an interview with her. And she was in the museum and she's learning about the history and she's learning more about Sam's story and Steve's family story. And she says, when I was receiving that award on stage from Steve, I never could have imagined that the two of us had anything in common. But now I realize that we're both here today because of the love of our grandmothers.
Wow.
So that's like everything you need to know about how we're thinking about the need to help people understand that we're talking about these themes of humanity that translate beyond the time and space that existed in the 1930s and 40s. And so we want to recognize and thereby inspire others to take the torch from upstanders and survivors and use their character strengths to continue to run the race today. And it also brings people in. I mean, as you said, Rob, the opportunity we have to engage people in the meaningful lessons of this history is so vast when we think about how we can universalize it and make it meaningful for people who might not be Jewish, have a connection to the history, otherwise really think that there's anything there for them. So this has been a huge, I would say, catapult for our work and in terms of broadening our engagement with the broader community. And we're going on year 3 with Jesse. So June 22nd, if anybody wants to come or come to Cincinnati and see it for yourself, it is an incredibly inspiring evening.
And you've done a great job of summarizing how unique the center is, but also how important it is. We talked about the current era of people being so divided. And we did an event, my wife Valerie and I, Jackie, you spoke. I said a few words at this event recently. Most of the people in the room that we had invited were not Jewish. And you don't need to be Jewish to understand the universal nature and the themes of what you're discussing. And it's important. It applies in so many different directions. I think the Upstander event you just referenced is a good indication of that. But I will say that to your point, to reinforce what you said, coming to that event, if you can make it, it does sell out. If you can make it, it's definitely worth it. And for what it's worth, I thank you for all the good work you're doing, your team is doing, and it makes a difference. And it leaves me feeling positive in a difficult world we live in, regardless of religion, political affiliation. There's a lot going on in the background, but what you're describing and the whole idea of upstanders and what the Holocaust and Humanity Center represents is really positive. So thank you for that. And I know there's a lot of big things happening with Auschwitz exhibit coming. And I know the museum has already grown significantly, but it's only going to continue to make more and more of an impact. So thanks for all that you're doing, that your team is doing. And we're excited about what lies ahead in terms of that impact.
It's a privilege. I tell people, some people will say, how do you, in the midst of like the time we're living in, right? Which regardless of how you feel about our politics, I think everybody feels like it's an urgent time. Everybody feels
Yeah.
like the stakes are high. And, so people say, how do you do that work every day? It's so dark. And I'm like, oh, you're missing the whole point. It is,
Yeah.
If people like your parents who experience the absolute worst depths of human depravity can come here and say, not only do I have hope, I have so much hope that I'm going to devote my life and my passion and my time to building an organization that educates people because I'm that sure that we can change the outcome next time. I mean, where is there an excuse for any of us to not feel hopeful? You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
it's really inspiring. And I think it's the kind of work that it's the kind of thing people need to hear, that their one act in one moment really does matter. We have so many stories throughout the history of people whose entire families were saved. Their, generations of their family since are here. And it's because one person did one thing. They sheltered them for a night. There's the story of Al Miller, the doctor who said, well, I can't figure out how to get your family out of Germany, but we'll put you in the hospital for 2 weeks. I'll give you an appendectomy and a nose job, and that'll give your wife some time. I mean, and by the way, it took like many people, one after another, without any hindsight coordination to know I have to play that role or it won't all happen. They just did what they could in the moment, and that paved the way for other people to do their part. We talk about this. I'll have to do a shameless plug for the HHC podcast, the Upstander Ripple Effect. We talk about exactly that, right? That upstanding it's a ripple effect that happens. Somebody does their part, that paves the way for someone to do their part, and before you know it, in hindsight, we can see an entire family is here because of that. But in the moment, it feels like, gosh, my little thing, letting somebody stay for a night, even doing a surgery like that, that's just kind of a nominal thing in the grand scheme of things, right? Well, it really counts. It really counts in hindsight. So what we do matters.
Absolutely. And that's a great way to leave people thinking about how they can make an impact, how they can make a difference. again, with the show notes, we'll put in some links to the podcast, to the website, and all the good things you've got going on. I'm sure we could double the length of this episode and talk further, but
for
let's
sure.
leave it here. Yeah, and maybe we will in a future episode. But Jackie, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me about the great work that you're doing, about your life. I learned a few things about you that I didn't already know, so that's a lot of fun too. But again, the impact that the Holocaust and Humanity Center and that you're making and leading the Holocaust and Humanity Center alongside your team is moving and sincerely appreciated. So more to come, and look forward to talking again soon. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob. It was a real pleasure. Really, really appreciate it.
For more information about the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center, check out www.holocaustandhumanity.org. The comprehensive site describes exhibits, events, education, and upstander programs, as well as links to the Holocaust Center storytelling podcasts. Thanks again for joining us on the Super Performers Podcast today, powered by 4100 FS. I hope you not only enjoyed listening, but you found the insights thought-provoking and relevant. We'll be back soon with another episode of Super Performers, Insights from the Driven. This is Rob Herman. Bye for now.